critical decade is particularly apt. Indeed, I do believe this will be the critical decade when it comes to an energy transition and decarbonizing the world's energy mix. But I don't believe it's the critical decade for the reasons that some have said it will be. For example, I don't believe that the world is going to end in 12 years, and that therefore, in this critical decade, we must dramatically overhaul all of our infrastructure so that we achieve net neutrality of carbon emissions. No, I don't believe that. I do, however, believe that in this critical decade, between now and 2029 or 2030, the world must lay the groundwork for what is to come. Yes, we will deploy a lot of clean energy infrastructure, and you will see it. But the vast gains in infrastructure will happen thereafter. In the 2030s and the 2040s, leading up to an eventual decarbonization, largely, of the energy system by mid-century. By mid-century, the hope is that the world, in order to meet its Paris climate targets and limit warming to roughly 2 degrees Celsius or thereabouts, the hope is that the world will achieve, in the developed parts of the world, an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, with the developing world following shortly thereafter. That's all got to happen by mid-century or shortly thereafter. And so this critical decade is when we lay that groundwork. It's not the critical decade because in the 1980s we would have said, aha, the 2020 to 2030 decade will be critical. No, we've just wasted all of our chances so far. And now by default, this becomes the critical decade. We do not have another chance, another shot at this. Today, I want to do 3 things. I want to first tell you a little bit about why we should celebrate the progress we've made and not be super pessimistic with where we've come. Second, I want to talk about how far we have to go, and in particular, why it is that the recent trends of renewable energy growing rapidly, those recent trends could stop, that past may not be prologue. Finally, I want to end with some recommendations for what we can do about all of this. And to preview them, my recommendations come in 3 flavors. First, I believe that governments around the world must level the playing field between clean and dirty energy. Second, I believe they then must work hand in hand with private firms to create new technology options. These new technology options are what we're then going to be able to deploy to enable a clean energy transition. And finally, I do believe there is an important role for governments around the world to play in what I'll call setting the architecture of the clean energy transition. This 3-step process, by the way, it's not all linear, they happen in parallel. This 3-part solution is, in my mind, a balance between harnessing the great power of markets and also inserting a guiding hand by governments, policies, and societies. That balance is very important because then we can bring the best elements from both sides. Many of you may be curious, and you may have already heard, about a Green New Deal and prospects for such a radical overhaul of our infrastructure. I will comment on that. I'll tell you what I think about a Green New Deal. Let me preview by saying, I believe that a balanced, moderate approach that harnesses market forces, but also is bold in its vision and architecture, that's not only the best way to move forward, it's the only way to move forward. So let me start by celebrating some of the progress that we have made to date in renewable energy. By 2020, wind and solar energy will produce 10% of the world's electricity, up from virtually 0 at the turn of the century. Now look, I've been in this business for over a decade. If you told me a decade ago that this would be the case, I wouldn't believe you. There's just no way that I'd believe that we would have the dramatic growth of wind and solar that we have. And hand in hand with that dramatic growth has been a dramatic fall in costs and prices. Since 2010, the cost of an onshore wind turbine has fallen by 25%, and since 2010, the cost of a solar panel has fallen by over 80%. Solar energy, which is the topic of my book, Taming the Sun, solar energy is now the cheapest, fastest growing source of energy around the world. That's another statement that had you made to me 10 years ago, I would have laughed you out of the room. But here we are. And those milestones deserve to be celebrated. In India, where I have just moved to join Renew Power, as was mentioned, Renew Power is India's largest clean energy company, and we also produce 1% of the world's electricity this year and reduce its carbon emissions by 0.5%. In India, solar and wind have grown even more tremendously in the last few years. Over the last 7 years, they've grown at an annual rate of 20% per year, and there's still a long way to go. Solar and wind are only 7% of India's electricity today, and India's per capita electricity consumption is just 1/4 of China's, and less than 1/10 of the gas-guzzling United States, where I left. So we've got a long way to go, not just in increasing the amount of wind and solar that India uses, but also in bringing abundant energy to India's masses. India as a country is going to economically develop. It's morally incumbent on India and on the rest of the world to bring modern energy to its growing population. And the hope is that we'll be able to do it through clean and renewable energy. Now, it is instructive to remember how we got to this remarkable place where clean energy is suddenly competitive with fossil fuels. One other statistic from India is that solar and wind power are now cheaper than 70% of the existing coal power supply. I'm not talking about new power plants. I am saying if I build a new solar power plant or a new wind power plant, it will compete with an existing coal power plant. The variable cost of running 70% of India's coal power plants, the majority of that fleet, is higher per kilowatt hour, that's a unit of energy, than the cost of building new solar and wind power plants levelized per kilowatt hour of the electricity they generate. That is a remarkable statistic, and it's only going to get better as the cost of these technologies fall. So how did we get here? I want to debunk one in vogue theory that's floating out there. It is not the case that we only got here because we built more and more solar panels and wind turbines and deployed more and more of them. There is a graph floating around that will tell you that because of a law known as Wright's Law, because we are able to continue to increase the production of solar and wind, their costs will continue to fall. That happens to be true now. But the gains in solar and wind were not always simply because of increased scale of production. Increased scale of production happened to be coincident with the falling costs. But for much of the 20th century, they were not the primary driver of falling costs. In the 20th century, I'm going to dwell on solar for a little bit. In the 20th century, the reason solar costs fell so much was primarily due to investments in innovation, in research, development, and demonstration of solar technologies. The first solar cell was invented in 1954 in Bell Laboratories in the United States. After that, solar went into a little bit of a lull. It grew very slowly because nuclear happened to suck all of the oxygen out of the room. You may recall that nuclear was the last great hope for cheap, clean, and abundant energy. Nuclear has since stalled, unfortunately, in my opinion, because of rising costs and because of activism. But nuclear provides an instructive example for solar. I believe that nuclear stalled primarily because innovation stopped in nuclear energy. Anyway, because nuclear sucked all the energy out of the room in the 1950s, there wasn't very much investment to go around in solar. But then came the oil crisis in the 1970s. Because of the Arab oil embargo, for example, gas prices shot up in the United States. And under President Jimmy Carter, the United States increased its investment in solar energy research, development, demonstration, and deployment. And for a golden few years, we invested rapidly in new solar technologies and scaling them up. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan and the Republican wave in the United States decided that the federal government had invested too much in these alternative technologies and decided to curtail support. Solar energy then migrated from the United States to other countries that took the lead on developing the technology. Japan was the leader in the 1990s. Then in the 2000s, Germany would take the lead. But before we go there, I want to make the point that up until 2000, the reduction in cost in solar energy was primarily driven by investments in improving the technology. After 2000, the cost reductions in solar energy have primarily been driven by increasing the scale of production. In the decade of the 2000s, the German policy of feed-in tariffs was probably the most consequential policy that enabled the costs of solar to fall. Those feed-in tariffs provided a guaranteed price premium for solar energy that was deployed on rooftops or in fields around the country. Thanks, ironically, to the generosity of the German people who are still paying the bill for that policy, we now have remarkably cheap solar energy. The solar energy industry scaled up, and now China has taken over most of the manufacturing of solar from countries like Germany. And China is continuing to provide the scale needed for solar to fall in cost. So I guess the lesson I want to leave you with when it comes to solar energy is that first, research, development, and demonstration, investments in laboratories, for example, in the United States, in Japan, Germany, that's what caused the initial price decline of solar. And the continued price decline of solar has then been caused by scaling up. The larger your factory is, the more you can spread fixed costs over variable costs. The more factories you build and the more solar panels you produce, the more you can wring production efficiencies out and benefit from learning by doing. So it's this two-stage process that's driven the cost of solar down. By the way, the same thing appears to be happening now with lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries have a long history. There was a lot of research done in them. Then they were used in consumer electronic markets. They grew in cell phone markets, and now they're being used in electric vehicles and for grid-scale energy storage. Again, the same process. Research, development, demonstration, and then the economies of scale. So it's important to remember how we got to where we are, because these are lessons we're then going to have to carry over when we think about creating the next generation of technology options. So that's the first part of the lecture, is celebrating the progress to date. Now you may think, wow, solar and wind are growing rapidly. Solar is the fastest growing energy source on the planet. India has only 7% of its electricity coming from solar and wind. It has so much more room to grow. Why on earth are we worrying? And who gave me this podium to talk to you about interesting ideas? We've already solved this thing. Let's just keep doing what we did, right? Wrong. It would be a catastrophic error in this critical decade, for the next 10 years, to continue doing what we have been doing so far. What we've been doing so far has worked pretty well. But if we continue those policies, if governments seem to think, I can just subsidize the deployment of solar and wind, or they're actually cheap enough, I don't even need to subsidize them, I'll just mandate them. And they'll keep growing, and we'll have more clean energy, and that'll be the end of the game. They will be sorely disappointed. Let me give you some statistics as to why it is that renewable energy, which looks so promising in its exponential rise right now, could actually hit a wall. As the amount of solar energy increases, I'm using solar, but the same principles apply to wind. As the amount of solar energy increases on a particular electricity grid, it starts to eat its own lunch. That is to say, the first solar panel is very useful. It produces power in the middle of the day on a hot summer afternoon, right when there's a lot of air conditioning demand. That's great. But the millionth solar panel, the 10 millionth, the 100th millionth solar panel, is suddenly going to start competing with the rest of the solar panels to produce excess energy at a time of day when solar is already meeting most of the energy demand. And because you can't control when the sun shines, it happens to shine a lot in the middle of the day, the next solar panel will be relatively useless. Its marginal value is not very high. So even if its cost is quite low, the value may be even lower. And as economics tells us, markets do not like to deploy a technology whose marginal value is below its marginal cost. So solar could very well undercut itself. Now, in a paper in Nature Energy, I and some colleagues published results of some studies arguing that at 30% penetration of solar onto an electricity grid, that is 30% of the energy comes from solar, the value of the next solar panel is 70% lower than it used to be when there was no solar on the grid. That's solar eating its own lunch. As a result of this, you could see solar and wind hit a wall. Right now, it looks great. There isn't that much of them on the grids, and so grids get value from deploying more of them. But as you have a great deal of solar and wind, 10%, 20%, 30%, suddenly you no longer have an economic case to deploy any more of them. Let me take a more local example to my work in India, not local here. In India, by 2022, the government has a target of 100 gigawatts of solar, 60 gigawatts of wind. All of this energy is concentrated in several western and southern states. And in some of those states, take Andhra Pradesh, a state in the south, it could be the case that on a summer afternoon, the solar and wind energy are producing 2 times as much energy as the whole state requires, it demands. What on earth is going to happen with all of this energy? And if you have so much excess energy, where will be the economic incentive to continue deploying more solar and wind energy? That is going to be a very real problem that we face in this critical decade. And unless we lay the groundwork right now to solve those issues, we'll hit a wall. We will have said, this strategy that's worked historically, we will continue to pursue, and we will have no backup plan when renewable energy stalls. One final statistic, China, which has led the deployment of renewable energy, last year in 2008 had to curtail 8% of all the wind power that it generated. Curtailment is a euphemism. It's a euphemism for throwing it away. China threw it away. It had nothing to do with that power. Because in tandem with rapidly deploying new clean energy sources, we are going to have to reimagine, redesign our energy systems to be far more flexible. Now, all of you in this room are probably thinking, dude, storage. Storage is going to be really cheap, and that's going to save the day, right? Elon Musk is saying that, and he says it way more charismatically than I can say it. Storage isn't going to save the day. I hate to break it to you. Elon Musk's batteries, lithium-ion batteries, are great for storing energy up to 4 hours, maybe even 6 hours. But with renewable energy, we actually have periodicity or seasonality that extends far beyond that daily cycle. We'll need to store energy for longer than 6 hours, longer than days, longer than weeks, maybe even months or seasons. We're going to need flexibility in our energy systems to do far more than batteries can. Some researchers at MIT and I simulated an electricity grid that had super, super, super cheap lithium-ion batteries and super, super, super cheap solar PV. And we still could not find a cost-optimal configuration of that grid that depended on more than 40% solar power. So going forward, I believe that in order to preempt solar energy and wind energy hitting a wall by eating their own lunch, to preempt that, we're going to need a whole battery of solutions. No pun intended. Just kidding, pun very much intended. And that battery of solutions is going to be not just today's batteries. It's going to be larger transmission grids. It's going to be a mix of different generators. Fossil fuels are actually quite good at ramping up and down to compensate for renewable energy. Maybe we'll find a way to generate fossil fuels cleanly by capturing their emissions. We'll require flexible demand. If you and I and every industrial consumer of energy is able to change our demand so that we demand electricity when the solar and wind are generating it, then we can tolerate a lot more of this volatile, intermittent, renewable energy because the demand, perhaps even from smart charging electric vehicles, will line up with the supply. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why it could be catastrophic if renewable energy hits a wall and we don't prepare adequately in this critical decade. I argue in my book, Taming the Sun, that solar energy should be the dominant source of energy in our electricity sector and ultimately for the entire world's energy consumption. And the reason for this is it's plainly our most abundant energy source. More energy comes from the sun every hour to the Earth's surface than the world uses in a whole year. We better use this. We better use it to the tune of 33% solar electricity in our electricity mix globally by 2050. That, in my opinion, is a checkpoint. That's going to enable us by 2050 to get to a near zero carbon electricity sector. And by the end of the century, we'll need solar energy that's accounting for a majority of humanity's energy consumption. That's a much more ambitious target. We won't get there if these sources end up hitting a wall, if we blindly focus on the strategies of former decades in this upcoming critical decade. I also want to make the point that electricity is not the entirety of energy. In fact, it is only a small minority. 25% of the world's emissions come from electricity. The remainder of the emissions come from agriculture, 24%, industry, 21%, transportation, 14%, and other sources. So we will need strategies to decarbonize all of these other sectors. Electricity and solar energy can help. In fact, they must be central as we, for example, electrify the transportation sector, as we use electricity to power industrial processes. But solar energy, as it is conceived today, simply plugging into an existing legacy grid, is not going to do us very good. So that brings me to my third point. My third and final point is, what do we do about it? And just to be nested and recursive about it, my third and final point is split up into 3 subpoints. The first subpoint is that we ought to level the playing field. I believe that governments around the world should enact carbon taxes, and I hope that my government, well, my former government, the United States, I now live in India, the United States leads by example by enacting its own carbon tax. There are very good reasons to believe that we may not be able to muster the political will to do so, but let me tell you about why every Nobel-winning economist over the last couple decades, every chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and former Treasury secretaries all co-signed an article in the Wall Street Journal arguing that a carbon tax is by far the most efficient policy to level the playing field between clean and dirty alternatives. They agreed on 5 principles. They agreed that the price of a carbon price ought to rise over time to take into account the rising social cost of emitting greenhouse gas emissions. They agreed that there should be some element of a border adjustment. One way to do this is to make sure that you put a carbon tax on imports and you put a carbon tax on domestically consumed things that have carbon entailed in the production of those goods, such as, say, gasoline. But you rebate the carbon tax on exports. That's one way of ensuring that you don't have a problem known as carbon leakage. They agreed that it's a good idea to return the dividends from this carbon tax equitably across the United States to families, on the order of about $650 per person if you raise $200 billion. Now this happens to make for a progressive taxation policy. If you look at a graph of income deciles and how much each family will benefit or be hurt by a carbon tax that returns its dividends equitably, the lowest decile has the highest gain proportionally, and the highest decile has the lowest gain. In fact, they are hurt, the 90 to 100th percentile. And that's how it should be, a carbon tax that is progressive. They believe that a carbon tax can replace other regulations, and this is true. A carbon tax is a more efficient way of leveling the playing field between clean and dirty alternatives. But this is only the first of my 3 solution points, my first of 3 sub-points, leveling the playing field through a carbon tax. The second of my 3 is to create technology options, because I don't believe that a carbon tax is sufficient to induce the technological innovation that we need in order to solve this climate problem and achieve a clean energy transition. A carbon tax is quite good at achieving scale for the technologies and options that already exist. It's what we call in economics a demand-pull policy. There I am calling myself an economist. I'm not. I'm a physicist. I'm an imposter economist. But I've read enough of the literature to know that we need both demand-pull policies that incentivize the scale-up of technology options, as well as technology-push policies that create new options. Remember the story of solar. Solar had a two-part history. We created options through research, development, and demonstration. Then we scaled up today's silicon solar panels and harvested the production economies, the efficiencies of scale. We need the same thing, but we need to do it for 33 other technologies. The International Energy Agency argues that there are 37 technologies that we need for a clean energy transition, and only 4 of them are remotely on track. Wind energy, solar energy, batteries for electric vehicles, and even that is kind of iffy. Lighting, LED lights are doing very well. But we have 37 other technologies. We need to be able to capture and sequester carbon dioxide emissions. We need efficient ways to produce iron, steel, cement. We need new drop-in replacement fuels for planes and ships and trucks and things that are really hard to decarbonize with electricity. In my opinion, the largest set of breakthroughs has to do with hydrogen. We need to transition toward a hydrogen economy because hydrogen is a beautiful way to store solar energy. You take solar energy, you produce electricity. That electricity runs a device called an electrolyzer that splits water and produces hydrogen, and hydrogen can then be used as a fuel. It can be used as a fuel for a car. The Toyota Mirai, I think, is the one quite unpopular car that uses hydrogen. It can also be used as a feedstock for industrial processes. It can also be combined with carbon dioxide that you sequester from an industrial process and combined to make a synthetic fuel that you can then put in an airplane or into a ship. So there are so many things we can do with hydrogen, but there are breakthroughs that need to be made. We also need to harvest production scale to reduce the cost, for example, of that electrolyzer device that splits water. So my second point is we must create technology options. This is not just harnessing markets, as the first option was. This will require government to take a little more of an active role. It's not too expensive. The world need only double or triple its investment in research, development, and demonstration from about $15 billion to $30 or $45 billion. And by spending those dollars very prudently around the world, as was committed to, by the way, by 20 of the leading economies in the Mission Innovation Pledge made in 2015, I believe that these countries can make serious progress on these 33 different technologies and work hand in hand with industry. Industry, remember, is going to be the primary innovator in this energy transition. Finally, we've talked about leveling the playing field by taxing carbon. We've talked about creating technology options through research, development, and demonstration. Finally, I want to talk about setting the architecture. Because it won't be enough just to create the options and to set the markets kind of right by pricing carbon. Governments will have to take a little bit of a heavy-handed role in setting the architecture. They will have to make difficult choices. They'll have to make a choice, for example, on do we want to transition to a hydrogen economy? Do we want to have mostly battery-fueled electric vehicles or hydrogen-fueled vehicles? How will we structure our electricity markets, and what policies should go into structuring a market that is equitable to many different types of zero-carbon sources? Nuclear energy, renewable energy, fossil fuels with their emissions captured. How are we going to design our cities to be dense and energy efficient? How are we going to make sure that our buildings are extremely efficient, maybe even net zero? Many of these policy objectives may not be accomplished even if we create the technology options and price carbon. So that's why the third architecture step is going to be an important role for the government to play. Now, all of this said, I want to close by mentioning today's political term du jour, which is Green New Deal. Is a Green New Deal a good idea? Almost certainly not the way it's been framed. A Green New Deal that attempts to overhaul infrastructure in the next 10 years and achieve net zero emissions in the United States would destroy enormous amounts of value. It would be needlessly destructive, and it would not bring together the various stakeholders that will be essential to an energy transition. Rather, I want to harken back to a document that was created in the waning days of the Obama administration. In fact, I want to honor one of the more recent recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize, who I'm really hoping stood right here, because that would be awesome. President Obama released the Mid-Century Deep Decarbonization Strategy. It's a beautiful policy document. It lays out pathways for the United States to decarbonize not just its power sector, but also its industrial sector, its transportation sector. It works on land use and agriculture. It's a very well thought out document that harnesses innovation and technology options, market reforms, carbon pricing, and lays out an architecture for this transition to take place. It is well thought out. It is embarrassing, in my opinion, that the party of Obama seems to have forgotten the beautiful vision that the president laid out. I strongly believe that we don't need to shift any Overton window and create some space for new and radical solutions to climate change. The solutions I have proposed are quite radical in and of themselves. Let us not ignore the fact that we need a balance between harnessing market forces and having government interventions to set the architecture and invest in new technology option creation. And we have moderate voices willing to pull in today's actors, fossil fuel companies, who will need to be participants in an energy transition, as well as brand new actors, like the company I'm a part of, Renew Power. And will need to be global in our perspective and make sure that we don't subordinate important goals like economic growth and energy access, and I'm very close to this in the country I now work, to goals of stopping climate change and achieving a clean energy transition. We can achieve them all, but only through extremely carefully, well-planned interventions that also harness the market. With that, I'm thrilled to be here and honored at the invitation. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you about clean energy and climate change.